about climate resilience and sea level adaptation.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And just want to start with the beginning of Charles Dickens' novel. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. And so his novel began about a time of turmoil at the eve of the French Revolution in a novel that was set between the cities of London and Paris. And I think we can probably agree with the urgency of climate change and sea level rise that we are again in a time of turmoil. Perhaps we've never left the times of turmoil. And what I want to tell you is a story that is about two cities. And one of those cities you'll see on the top right or left for you is Detroit, which is actually not on the coast, but is experiencing pronounced flooding, especially even in clear sky days. In fact, it's 1,000 kilometers from the coast in a part of the United States that we sometimes call the Middle East. On the other side, we have Galveston in the aftermath of Hurricane Ike. And that was a 2008 hurricane that devastated the city of Houston and the Galveston area. Galveston is actually really just a sandbar out in the ocean. And although this story might seem uniquely American, it might be about these two cities, I think what we can see is that the characters and the scenery might change, but you're going to find out that there are similarities about how we think about what we're going to do in the future and how these different communities have evolved. Now, the start of this story is going to begin about a century ago, about 120 years ago. And if you were to go and sail around the Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet, what you would see is a coastline that looks distinctly similar to today. You would see probably fairly pronounced changes that would be visible in the Pine Island and Mudson Sea area. But if you were to go to the Ross Ice Shelf and a lot of the larger ice shelves, it would be distinctly recognizable. In fact, Ursula Le Guin wrote a beautifully subversive short story in 1982 about an all-female expedition team that visited the Ross Ice Shelf and retraced some of Captain Scott's original expedition. And Ursula was very well aware of the gender dynamic of polar exploration, especially the way it's portrayed in the literature. And in fact, the Ross Ice Shelf would have largely looked the same in 1902 when Scott visited, in 1982 when Ursula Le Guin said her story, and today, with the exception of the occasional detachment of one of the large tabular bergs that we occasionally see. Now, I want to start this story a little bit closer to my home, perhaps not your home. And what you're seeing is a map of the Mississippi River Basin, one of the most major river basins within the United States. I've also marked the location of Detroit. I live a little bit outside of Detroit. It's slightly outside of the Mississippi River Basin, which will be important for this story. And the other location is going to be Houston, which is actually all the way in Texas, on the other side of the Mississippi Basin, just outside again. Now, the reality is that we can start this story in a lot of different places. That there is an important story that you should be aware of the forced displacement of the indigenous people that populated the Mississippi Basin. That's not the story that I have to tell you today. It's not a story that I can tell you, but it's an important story about how those people have been displaced. The story that I want to talk to you about starts in about 1875. 1875 is really the first initiation of a federal system to deepen the Mississippi River and widen it and to engineer the river basin. The motivation for this is not flood protection yet. It is commerce. And that is because the steamboat has become a powerful mechanism of transporting goods from one portion of the United States to another. And the goal here is to systematically increase the depth to increase the ability of transport in both high and low waters. This plan is controversial among scientists and engineers. And the reason it's controversial is because engineers quickly recognize that if you deepen the Mississippi River, if you widen it, and if you confine it, you are going to increase the probability that there are disasters. You're going to increase the flux of the river, and they are concerned that there'll be increased shipwrecks, recreational disasters. They are not quite thinking about flood yet. By 1879, flood risks are becoming more of an issue, especially as that land is expanded upon by colonizers. And by 1879, Congress approves funding for a federal levee protection system. Now, to be clear, levees had existed in that area since at least the 1700s, built by French settlers. Of course, the indigenous people had long lived there and had recognized the flooding risks. This is the first federal intervention. By 1918, there's a series of floods. The federal government now invests in the Federal Flood Control Act. They ask US engineers to build a system of levees. This group of engineers will eventually become the Army Corps of Engineers that are currently responsible for most of the levee systems and seawalls that are currently being built in the United States. By 1926, these levees are nearly completed, and they have been successful where they have been erected. They have minimized a couple of floods that would have probably resulted in a few displacements. By the summer and fall of 1926, we start to see heavy rains across large portions of the Mississippi Basin. In modern standards, we probably call that a persistent blocking pattern, and we probably call the event that is hitting the area an atmospheric river. Again, large amounts of moisture that are funneled through the tropics, and it's actually just sitting there and raining on the entire area. The rivers are rising, and by 1927, the first levees start to breach. Now, although these levees were built through a national program, they are locally controlled. And what happens is as these levees start to be breached, you are flooding large portions of these communities, especially along the Mississippi River Basin, along the river coasts. But because they are locally controlled, communities quickly realize that they can attempt to protect their communities by blowing up upstream levees. We set up a series of competition. Communities actually erect armed guards around their levees to prevent people from coming up from upstream and blowing them up. And they send roving parties out to try and relieve pressure upstream along the coast to prevent their communities from flooding. So we set up a competition rather than a cooperation. Again, this might seem like a peculiarity of the American system, but competition versus cooperation is generally a theme in adaptation. Okay, it gets worse. Because we are talking about the United States and the racist Jim Crow South, what happens is, as the primarily white farmers are evacuated, by gunpoint often, the primarily black sharecroppers are forced to actually maintain some of these levees and to attempt to fortify them with digging implements and other things. About 700,000 people are displaced, sometimes for months. Actually, the eventual President Hoover is responsible for some of these encampments. About 200,000 black folks are displaced by these. Now, Red Cross sets up a number of camps, but again, because of the cultural environment in many of these camps, not all of them, but in many of these camps, the black people, the sharecroppers, were excluded. They were denied aid at these stations. And this event triggers a migration outside of many of these regions, in which we find many of these folks migrating to industrial cities like Detroit, outside of the Mississippi River Basin. We see folks migrating to Houston, again, from over here, especially in the New Orleans region. There is a town, a small portion of Houston, which is called Frenchtown. This is because settlers, black settlers from New Orleans, French-speaking Cajuns, were only allowed in certain portions of the city. We see similar things in Detroit. The Black Bottom neighborhood becomes a vibrant black community. Again, we start to see some of these systems imported into our eastern and Midwestern cities as communities start to limit where these new immigrated communities can live. Now, if you're thinking about what the soundtrack of climate change is, surely it's got to be related to the blues, songs like When the Levee Breaks, When the Water Comes, that was exported from the misery of these people as they moved to Chicago, to Detroit, to Memphis, other places like that. It's a story about systematic failures and, frankly, the disasters that we create. So the lesson that I want you to take from this, and again, it might seem uniquely American, but vulnerability strongly depends on both the built environment, what we did to build these waterways, but also the social environment. The other lesson, which is important, is that disasters can trigger migration. What happens at the coast does not stay at the coast. We see this over and over and over. Every time there's a disaster, we see often local migration. Katrina resulted in a flux, again, to Houston. They're often temporary. People move back. People like to stay where they are. Every once in a while, the conditions are right in which you have a massive exodus, in which the situation is not conducive for people to returning. And again, those will be related to both the environmental conditions, but also the social component to the problem. Now, just to be clear about this story, the 1927 Mississippi flood was a disaster, but it had nothing to do with climate change. It was a weather-related phenomenon, but it was certainly amplified by the choices made about the built environment, and it was made catastrophic by the cultural landscape in which it occurred. Again, we can't divorce vulnerability from that cultural landscape. Every social scientist will tell you there's no such thing as a natural disaster because they all have human components to them. As we move forward in time, we're in the 1940s now. Again, if we were to visit the Antarctic ice sheet or Greenland ice sheet, we would certainly see a few changes, but again, it would be recognizable coastline. By this point, there is a massive flow of primarily black people outside of the racist Jim Crow South into industrializing cities in the Midwest, the East, as far away as Los Angeles. And what we see is an increasingly large community of black people and white people as well escaping to the industrialized cities. By this point, the war effort is going on. This is a picture of the Willow Run manufacturing plant, which is just outside of Detroit, about 15 minutes from where I live in Ypsilanti. During the peak of the war effort, they were producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Roosevelt labels this the arsenal of democracy because of the sheer amount of industrialization. The entire industrialization might of Detroit has been co-opted into the war effort. This is the location of Rosie the Riveter, for those of you who are perhaps familiar with that bit of propaganda. And as we see a larger population of black people, brown people moving into the region, we start to see the beginning of redlining, zones in which black people are forbidden to moving. We see racial covenants, homeowners associations begin to develop in which the sole goal is to limit where people can live. And as this industrialization proceeds, this area near Willow Run manufacturing plant actually becomes a predominantly black neighborhood. Willow Run is now shut down. There's actually probably about a 20-year gap in expectation of life expectancy just in that area compared to the surrounding area. As we approach the 2000s, now we start to see spectacular ice sheet changes. The Larsen B disintegrates in a both unexpected and shocking event. For those of you who remember it, we had always been told that ice deforms over thousands of years. It wasn't a big part of the climate. The NCAR didn't actually bother with ice sheet models. And all of a sudden, we find out that that's not true. We start to see, with increasing satellite measurements throughout the 2000s, that places like Pine Island and Thwaites and otherwise are starting to retreat. We're talking about grounding line migration. In this beautiful animation by Steph Lermite, we're starting to see retreat of Pine Island. coastline in certain portions of Antarctica are now quite a bit different than what explorers in the early 1900s would have seen. We see the near fragmentation of portions of the west, or a portion of the Thwaites ice shelf. So the question which I have been thinking a lot about is how will future vulnerability, which again involves both the built and social environment, how will that change with rising sea level rise? And really the most important question that I've been thinking about is, if we think about the communities that I have been working with, what do we do about that? It's one thing to know what's going to happen. It's another thing to actually try and take steps to prevent some of the worst effects. Now, let me just take a pause, and we're interested in what's going to happen in the future. Let me ask you, how many of you think we'll see 1 meter of global sea level rise by 2050? Raise your hands. Okay? By 2100?
Do you mean global average or local?
Global average. We're going to come back to regional and local in a second. Okay? By 2150. More of you. After 2150? A few of you. Never? Not sure all of you voted in this very unscientific poll. Well, we can go and take a look at exactly what the previous speakers have been talking about, and this is just a digestion of really the IPCC projections associated with the U.S. interagency representation of that report. And I just want to point out, global sea level rise, by 2050, roughly tens of centimeters, okay? On the high end, possibly less. And again, these are just showing the variability between projections with the extreme and the low ends of them. By 2100, maybe a meter, 3/4 of a meter, something around there. Again, at the high end of the projections, and the lower end is much lower. Of course, if you're a homeowner, the timescale of a mortgage in the United States is about 30 years. And so you're probably less concerned with that 2100 timescale. But it's not easy to compute global sea level rise, and to be honest with you, it's actually not even all that important, because what we adapt to is regional sea level rise. What we care about is local. And when we look at local, this is primarily for the United States, we see a massive range. So again, by 2050, it's pretty similar, tens of centimeters at the high end. But as we start to go out towards 2100, we get multi-meters in certain locations at the highest end of these projections. Where do we expect to see the highest end of these projections? The Gulf Coast of the United States, which is currently experiencing subsidence and is expected to see amplified sea level rise associated with fingerprints and all of that stuff. What we also expect is sea level drops in portions of the United States. Alaska. People have talked a lot about the sea level fingerprints. We're talking about the uplift in regions. And it's tempting to think that this uplift or this uplift and lack of sea level rise, the drop in sea level rise, is not as devastating. But what we're seeing in Alaska in many communities is massive increases in erosion associated with that sea level drop, associated with reduction of sea ice and increased wave action. Who's being affected with that? Well, there's a number of indigenous populations that have been actually forced to live near the coastal region by the Department of Indian Affairs because it was accessible by barge. So we're already seeing displaced communities in some of these regions. Well, if we're going to think about planning, what we want to think about is, well, which of these scenarios are we on? Can we rule them out? And this is an attempt to look at just the Amundsen Sea embayment using the bicycles model. And many of you are far more experts in this than I am. But this bar on the bottom is the scenario. That's the IPCC scenario. Turns out it actually doesn't make that big of a difference in this one model run. Up here, the solid Earth people will be happy we included GIA. About 10, 20%, depending on what parameters you take. You'll be happy about that. But the important thing here is, at least in this particular model, is the atmosphere and ocean that controls the evolution. Now, I have lumped everything ocean to be everything associated with the melt rate. So how you tune that melt rate parameterization is all lumped into the ocean over here. And so if you think about, if we want to actually improve our projections, again, a single model, we'd have to actually improve these ocean atmosphere projections. Now, we haven't talked about multi-models. Other people can do that much better than I have. We haven't talked about the physics in the model. And it turns out that if you kind of think about our model initial state, we start in about 2010. observed ocean thinning is driving grounding line retreat. By about 2050, we see in this projection under moderate ocean forcing, again, the grounding line has retreated even further. You've seen pronounced thinning. By the time we get to 2100, we're actually kind of quasi-sitting here in a fairly deep spot, 1,300 meters, and with a fairly steep slope to the grounding line. And there has been some speculation that if you get a tall cliff, you can promote ice cliff instability. We saw some talks earlier. So we attempted to put that to see how big an effect that has in the model. And it turns out that we can get more than, say, 3 centimeters, which is a far cry from the meter or 2 meters that we were talking about earlier. And we can get maybe 15 centimeters, or we could probably squeeze 30 centimeters. Again, all you really do for our simulations is rescale this axis. Whether you get into those large sea level rise scenarios still depends on how much you melt the bottom of the ice, how much you snowfall. The snowfall has less of an effect, the ocean has a bigger effect. So turns out, at least in our simulations, Thwaites doesn't do an awful lot. I guess we're one of the stabler ones. Pine Island and other places do a lot more, and it turns out it's related to shear margin weakening as much as anything else. So whether you include shear margin weakening or not. Well, every time someone publishes a paper, I get a call from a practitioner who wants to know if they should head for the high ground and if all of a sudden we're going to see a tsunami of sea level rise approaching. This is especially true of anything that uses the word doomsday glacier. This is particularly important to places like Houston, where the Army Corps of Engineers aims to invest about $16 billion. $16 billion in a seawall to attempt to defend this strip of land and the greater city of Houston. Now, just for context, this is the tide gauge outside of Galveston right before Hurricane Ike. You see upwards of 2 meters of sea level rise in about 6 hours, which puts in context the magnitudes of sea level rise that we are often trying to communicate to communities because they lived through this. It probably was higher than 2 meters. The instrument failed, doesn't come back online for a while. They didn't cut that off, the instrument died. There was probably upwards of 3 meters of sea level rise associated with that local storm surge. So the question that we've been thinking about in my group, University of Michigan, and a lot of other places is a question that a lot of you have probably also thought about, which is, okay, it's not that we don't know anything, it's that we don't have perfect knowledge. And what do? What should we tell some of these communities? And for context, as far as I know, the latest plans for the Ike Dike, $16 billion, do not factor in future sea level rise or projections. They are based solely on historical flood risks, historical hurricanes. Some of the original plans for a much more vigorous sea defense were actually voted down by some of the people because they would block their view of the ocean. So again, the cultural context matters. So one approach that we've been trying to go forward with is what we call community scenario planning. And the idea is, I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. And probably some of you have more confidence that you might know what's going to happen, but I don't. So we start thinking about a storyline, a story approach. What I can tell you is what would happen if a hurricane of this magnitude impacted the coast today. I can tell you what would happen if it hit the coastline in 2050 in the low or high sea level rise scenario. I can even tell you what it might happen in 2100 in the high and low sea level rise scenarios. I could tell you, without all that much knowledge about the probabilities, what would happen if it was preceded by hard rainfall for several weeks in advance. Inland flooding is swelling the rivers that are draining the region. So we can start to look at the effect of compound events. Because when we actually go out and talk to people, it's not always sea level rise that is their most immediate concern. It is hurricanes, it is flooding, and it is all of the other things that they see in their communities. In fact, if we decide to stop talking as much and actually go and listen, And we've been starting to do this in Detroit. We're starting to try and do this in coastal Georgia as well. What we find is when we go to these communities, especially these redline communities, these communities that have been systematically marginalized and neglected, and we start to ask them what they care about, what we find out a lot of these communities, these original communities that have been redlined in the 1940s and earlier, are already experiencing endemic flooding. This is not a future for them. This is a current reality. We find out that many of them, especially in the rural portions outside of the city, are already experiencing increased erosion, losing property. This is actually, depending on how rural they are, impacting septic systems. What we find out is, as we start to listen a little bit more, is they are already seeing flooding and sewage systems backing up into the streets and into their basements. Why is that happening? It's because a lot of these communities have got mixed sewer system, stormwater drainage systems that is controlled by pumps. When those pumps fail, and often they're quite old, you get a sewage backup. Those pumps and those sewage systems were designed for the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s. We are seeing systematic changes in climate. We're seeing more power outages. When the power goes out, we actually see failures of water treatment. Again, excavating raw sewage into the rivers. We also are starting to see people taking matters into their own hand. They're building their own seawalls along the coast. This is actually my colleague Ricky's cabin in the 1980s. He helped his father build a local seawall, probably illegal. It defended the cabin, but it also caused the eradication of his neighbors' cabins. So we're seeing competition again. And what I want to end with is a quote from one of my favorite authors, Bell Hooks. And she pointed out that the function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It is to imagine what is possible. And I think that that can be true for science and engineering as well. If we think about the function of science is to do more than simply tell people what might happen in 50, 100, 1,000 years, but to actually be partaking in that conversation for what our communities can do. Adaptation is about as much about understanding what's happened before so that we can imagine a future that is different than what has been before. And just want to point out that the Army Corps of Engineers required by Congress to do a 50-year cost-benefit analysis. Within the United States, the average wealth of a white family is about $171,000. Black families worth about 10% of that. Again, this seems like an American story. I've looked up the figures for Europe, and they are certainly better, but they are also grim. Your single best predictor of how well you survive a disaster is wealth. Last thing that I want to end with is you're all scientists and engineers for the most part. You focus on uncertainty. At this moment in history, we probably know more about what the future holds than at any point in time. The question is what we choose to do with that knowledge and how we choose to communicate it to the communities that need it the most. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was really thought-provoking, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of further conversations on this topic in the coming couple of days. We probably have time for just one question, if there is one now. No takers?
I think, just to comment, Jeremy, the topic you've introduced and the fact that we're taking science to the people is ultimately where we're going to be going for the rest of today for our panel discussion, and also into tomorrow, where we're going to hear a lot more about policy uptake, the value of the science we do, how we ensure that it's used. So lots of opportunity to dig into what you've just presented to us. I think thanks again.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks. All right. So wrapping up this session, before lunch, we have one final speaker, Sophie Weeks, who's going to talk about